Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
So Tim Dillon actually got interviewed by Ana Kasparian yesterday, which was surprising to me. I was interested to see that. And I know I've been covering Tim Dillon a lot here, and probably some of you in my audience don't want to hear about this guy all the time, and I understand that. I don't want to overemphasize his importance or anything, but I wanted to cover this interview because they mentioned something that I had forgot to mention about all this when it comes to the Epstein files and Tim Dillon's coverage of that. Which was that Tim Dillon spoke with Steve Bannon not that long ago. I actually covered it on this pod, so it was sometime in the last year or so, talking about like right-wing politics, right-wing populism, and this sort of theory of Steve Bannon's about politics. And Tim Dillon, I think that might have been the first time I covered him, or one of the first times, because that's sort of what his interest is like political strategy and the strategy of rhetoric and stuff like that. And that's what Steve Bannon is interested in as well. So that, plus the fact that they're both right-wing reactionaries, it was kind of a perfect match. But now that Tim Dillon has been talking about this Epstein files stuff a lot, it raises the question that Steve Bannon is one of the people most prominently featured in these Epstein files. He was talking to Epstein a lot about, what do you know, political strategy. So this is a very softball interview that Ana Kasparian did. She's clearly very much a fan of Tim Dillon, and she says that, but she does ask him a couple questions about Steve Bannon and Barry Weiss. So here's that.
Some of the stuff that's shocking to me is really about like Steve Bannon's close relationship with Epstein, because Bannon's been one of the loudest voices in releasing the files. And that makes me think maybe he didn't think it was ever going to happen.
Bannon, who I interviewed one time, I didn't know that he had like a relationship with Epstein. I would have asked him. I think, Bannon's a devout Catholic, right? He's a nationalist. Well,
Mm-hmm.
So it's an odd pairing, right? But if you read the documents, they surely had a lot of communication. I guess Bannon was making a documentary?
Mm-hmm.
Is that? Yeah. And Bannon was advising Epstein on how to re-enter polite society.
That's right.
That's uncomfortable. And it seems to be, I guess, for whatever reason, Bannon thought there was value in a relationship with a guy like Jeffrey Epstein. And that's something he'll have to answer, and he'll have to answer that.
I mean, I would love to hear him talk about it. But so far, despite everything that we've read in the files about Bannon's relationship with Epstein, it seems like Bannon has been relatively unscathed. Like, I don't really see a giant group of people demanding he answer for these communications he had with them, but with Epstein. But let me give you a few examples so the audience knows what we're talking about here. So yes, Bannon was working on a documentary to essentially launder Epstein's image, which is already not a good look. But Epstein actually gave Bannon some advice in November of 2018. So this is a text message exchange that we're now privy to because of the files that were released. So, but let me read this exchange to you. And it's basically Epstein telling Bannon, yo, you should really consider working in media because that offers you extra protections, right? He says, I'm refocused on you having a press/news base, even if it were called The Movement. It is so structurally elegant, privileged, funding, subscriptions. So he basically mentions you'll be able to avoid in-kind treatment, your notebooks, safe, etc. And Bannon says, you mean have media platform, not NGO/political platform. And basically at that point, Epstein says, yes, you get more protection if, it's not an NGO, if it's not a nonprofit, if it's a for-profit media organization, you have certain press rights, press freedoms, certain protections. You do have to do filings if you have a nonprofit and disclose some of your financials to the public. So he kind of showed the difference there. And a year later, Bannon went on to host War Room on Real America's Voice.
Well, it's also less ominous, right? So if you say like the Soros Open Society Foundation, which I think does do a lot of nefarious things, but all of these NGOs operate, primarily in the shadows, and they don't have for the most part, a lot of them don't have charismatic frontmen. So if you have a media operation and you are a talented broadcaster, it demystifies the entire operation a little bit.
What was also interesting is they had an exchange where Epstein said, why don't you own the whole populist right label? Take it from Trump. You should make it your own, but not because you actually believe in populism, but because you're going to use it as a way of manipulating people, which I thought was really interesting too. So the first time I ever saw you do a set, funny enough, was at a Barry Weiss event. There was a
friend of the show. We love her. Come back to us, Barry. Come back.
So it was in downtown LA.
It's all fixable, Barry. It's all repairable.
It was in downtown LA. It was a debate on something having to do with feminism. Yeah.
Feminism, new wave feminism. She had me do the debate and they paid me a lot of money.
You did the set before the debate?
The set, right.
The set was amazing. And I was like, I really like him. Yeah. And I figured you guys are good friends. And then
we were friendly, yes.
And then you started speaking out against what's been going down with Israel.
Yeah.
And things seem to have changed. You hint at it a lot on your show. Yeah. So what happened?
Barry is a one-issue voter. I don't think that's a shock to anyone. I think Barry is deeply worried about anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism's bad, and that it's not something to ignore. I had a very nice text exchange with her, maybe a year ago, and she was basically like, "You're part of a cultural space, where the anti-Semitism and blah 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 blah." And I think that I had earned a place in that cultural space because I had criticized what Israel was doing.
So a couple interesting things here. I think she should have dug a lot deeper on this because there's actually some pretty heavy implications to the fact that Tim Dillon has had Steve Bannon on before and also had a pretty softball interview with him. So it's kind of similar to what people have been saying about Joe Rogan, where so many of these people in these files have ended up on Joe Rogan's platform, and they're talking about a lot of similar things. So even the least sinister, least conspiratorial version of that is that an incredibly influential network of people that Epstein was involved with as a very powerful individual was kind of actively engaged with Joe Rogan's platform at the same time. He mentions recently in an episode with Cheryl Hines that Lawrence Krauss, who was a guest on Joe Rogan's pod, tried to get Joe Rogan, to meet with Epstein, and he refused, or I don't know. We don't know exactly what happens. Rogan is now saying, I was like, what are you talking about? Are you fucking kidding me? We don't know if that's true. He probably forgot, honestly, and is just making it up that he remembers. But point being that billionaires like Epstein recognize very well what the utility of a guy like Joe Rogan is. And that's why in his attempt to meet with Joe Rogan, he was very coy. I think he's funny. Introduce me to Joe Rogan. I think he's funny. There's nobody that thinks Joe Rogan is funny. That is not why Epstein wanted to hang out with Joe Rogan. He wanted to hang out with Joe Rogan for the same reason everybody else does, because Joe Rogan's incredibly influential. And if you befriend him, he'll let you come on his platform and talk for 4 hours uninterrupted about whatever you want to talk about. And so that's what a lot of Epstein buddies did, from Peter Thiel to Elon Musk, Donald Trump. And now Bannon has never been on the Joe Rogan Experience, but Tim Dillon has talked to Bannon. And that's another layer to all of this, because Bannon is much more strategy minded. And that's what he's talking to Epstein about in all of these text messages and emails that have come out between them. And that's what he talked to Tim Dillon about. And that's what he's still out here talking about all day. And the thing about Steve Bannon is because he's so strategy focused and rhetoric focused, it's kind of always impossible to know what exactly he's trying to do. Sometimes he's very straightforward about it. Sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. And you know that he's very keen on using methods of like manipulating the media. He likes to say things that get the media talking, and he knows how to say like the right thing for a certain portion of the media that they're gonna feed on it. And that's what he did recently when he came out and said, we're gonna have ICE surround the polls in the midterms. There's no reason for him to come out and say that. And like, honestly, what person on the right, even those that want to do that, who is happy that he came out and said that right now? Maybe like a month before the election when things are really heating up, it might make more sense and like benefit their movement for him to say that. It doesn't really benefit the movement right now. The reason he's doing that is probably because he wants to distract the media from the fact that he's all over these Epstein files. And so he would rather get them talking about ICE and Steve Bannon and the nationalist movement and blah, blah, blah. And so, I mean, Steve Bannon is very influential in that. ICE very well might be used at the polls in that capacity, at least to some extent in the midterms. That's a real risk. And it's possible that Steve Bannon saying that they should do it might inspire them to. But I think the layout of this situation is a little different, where Steve Bannon both doesn't really have to answer for this Epstein shit in the same way that other people do, because nobody expects Steve Bannon to be upstanding. Nobody expects him to be honest. Nobody expects him to even really be able to answer for anything. And that includes people that agree with him and are aligned with him, like Tim Dillon. They don't really expect him to have any good answers for this. And that's why Tim Dillon, at no point does he say like, I want to ask him about that. I mean, he did say he'll have to answer for that, but maybe he should have to answer to you. Maybe you should be trying to get him back on. Maybe you should be pressing him for answers about that in the same way that you've pressed for a lot of things, like the release of the Epstein files. And Tim Dillon, one of the reasons I like to cover him is because he has influence purely in the fact that a lot of people in MAGA world and Steve Bannon world and Trump world listen to this guy. Powerful people listen to this guy. I don't know why. I don't know what exactly they're getting out of it, if they like really listen or if they're just entertained by him. But he has sort of the ear of people like that, people like J.D. Vance. He supposedly sat down personally with J.D. Vance for a dinner where J.D. Vance told him that Donald Trump is not implicated in the Epstein files, to which Tim Dillon then came out on his show and said that. He said that's what J.D. told him, said he doesn't know if that's true, but that's what J.D. told him. So that's the use of a guy like Tim Dillon. If you have a private dinner with him and you tell him that Trump's not in the Epstein files, he'll go on his platform and say that. Because if you sit down with the vice president, that's like pretty impressive. And so as much as Tim Dillon, I think, has better discernment than some of these comedians, he also doesn't really have much scruples in terms of like what he is or isn't willing to do. Like the perfect example is the Saudi Arabia thing, where he took the money and was going to do the show, but then he was also blabbing about it on his podcast, which got him fired. So making jokes about Saudi Arabia, playing at some of the things that were controversial about it, while also saying, look, they paid me to look the other way, that got him fired. But this Steve Bannon thing, I think, shows the corruptness of the project that Tim Dillon is a part of. And that's why it's important that Ana Kasparian brought up this thing about right-wing populism and how that's part of what Epstein was talking to Bannon about, and about branding himself that way, and about creating a media organization where he can kind of take up that space. And Ana Kasparian correctly points out that that's what Steve Bannon has done. Epstein and him talked about that, and that is essentially the strategy that he has taken in maintaining a voice throughout all this time, which wasn't necessarily promised. There was a time before Steve Bannon had a podcast or anything like that when he used to work in Trump's first administration, then got fired. The reason he's been able to stay relevant the whole time is not because he's in Trump's inner circle. It's because he's on a podcast and he continues to maintain an audience. To some extent, it's AstroTurf. I don't know how he's able to stay on the air. I guess he kind of plays it pretty carefully in terms of what he says on there. But the point is that Steve Bannon going on Tim Dillon is a part of that project. And that project is exactly what he was discussing with Epstein behind the scenes while all this stuff was going on, while Trump was going through his first presidency all the way up until Epstein was arrested. That's when Steve Bannon was behind the scenes strategizing with Epstein. Why? Epstein was bad for Trump. And this was at a time when Epstein was having a lot of conversations about like wanting to bring down Trump and being bitter that Trump seems to have escaped accountability and things like that. And so it's not really clear what exactly Steve Bannon and Epstein were trying to do together. And given the fact that Tim Dillon and Steve Bannon have made the Epstein thing a part of their brand, mostly because of pressure from their audience. I think Tim Dillon a little bit more out of genuine curiosity because he's not best friends with the guy. Steve Bannon more so at a certain point had no choice but to be in favor of releasing the Epstein files. And so now that they're out, he also, it turns out, was on the other side of it, in trying to figure out how to launder Epstein's reputation to the media. So it elicits some questions about what exactly his role is in all of this stuff. And if I was Tim Dillon, it would elicit some questions of me about what my role is in bringing people like that to an audience. And that brings me to a quick update on Minnesota and Minneapolis, where ICE is still present. A few days ago, they made the announcement that they were going to draw down 700 agents, which still leaves over 2,000. So ever since then, those 2,000 agents have still been marauding the streets, still disappearing people, still being quite violent, and they've been ramping up their arrests of observers and the people who follow ICE agents around. And so it seems like the strategy of Tom Homan is to kind of de-escalate on the public front while trying to tamp down the resistance to ICE, but also still acknowledging that there's nothing they can do. The resistance does make ICE's job harder, and they are putting themselves at risk by arresting those protesters, not at risk of violence, but at legal risk. The reason they weren't doing that before is because it creates tough legal implications for them. It's easier in the long run if they're not doing stuff like that. But this is a situation where Tom Homan is trying to wind this down and possibly even try to bring this surge to a close. Tim Walz said that he expects that they're going to bring things to a close within a few days, or at least that he's expecting some kind of announcement to that effect. Now, he might just be saying that because he wants it to be true and he's trying to pressure it. I don't know that I see that. I think ICE will probably be in Minnesota at least for several more weeks. And they're definitely trying to give the impression that they're not backing down to these protesters. And they're also doing a lot of stuff like building up their capability to track these protesters in databases and tracking their identity, taking pictures of them when they arrest them. That's what they're doing now as they're arresting more of these people, is trying to enter them into these databases. And so this is the tech surveillance dystopia that people like Steve Bannon and Joe Rogan and Tim Dillon have ushered us into. And it really is a straight line, because these databases that are going to be used to track all kinds of American citizens for all kinds of reasons, and even go after them in some instances, are directly a result of the right-wing narrative on immigration. This is an invasion. These are criminals. They're here raping and pillaging and robbing. And so we need an aggressive military force to go in and extract these people and deport them. So now we got that. We got that part. But what we don't seem to have is all the millions of violent and horrible criminals that they said they were going to go after. So that was a lie. And yet we're still having people fed into databases. ICE is still arresting whoever they can. They have not slowed down the pace of arrests or who they're going after in Minnesota, which was never violent criminals. The thing that I want to emphasize here is that this is the bankruptcy of right-wing so-called populism and just right-wing ideology in general. This is rot. And the reason Steve Bannon is all over these Epstein files and also all over the right-wing movement in general and ideologically traceable back to all of these narratives is because this is just a part of the rot of our current society. We've allowed billionaires and rich people to have too much power, and so the people, the sycophants like Steve Bannon, who are willing to pretend to be populous but ultimately are trying to serve the interests of those billionaires, are going to succeed, and they're going to push their rotten form of politics anywhere they can. And by the way, this same thing has rotted the Democratic Party as well. So the right wing is completely rotted by this. And then what is supposed to be the representation of the left is also rotted by that same thing. Neoliberal, corporatist, capitalist slop. So the only hope is to go further left than that, because the left-wing ideology is the thing that these guys truly fear. Everybody from Steve Bannon to Jeffrey Epstein to even Joe Rogan and Tim Dillon, they fear left-wing ideology because that is the solution. Clawing back the wealth from the people who manipulate it, that makes it so that those guys can't run the grift that they're running. It's rot. And there's a solution for that rot. And it's that we eat them all. Just kidding. Just kidding. We overturn Citizens United and we tax the fuck out of them. We do that so we don't have to eat them.
Me too close to, too much to do. The mission is too crucial. Shout it out from the rooftops until I lose vocals. Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity.